Hi everyone, I am here with a true story. This one is called Jesus in My Pocket, and it is by Kathy Sheldon Davis. Alright. Joanne's teacher tapped the chalk on the blackboard as she wrote the day's assignment, leaning to the left with each careful stroke. Since the chalk trail started near the top of the board, Joanne was sure she had enough time for a quick adventure with the tiny doll she had hidden in her desk. Joanne! How could her teacher know what she was doing? She tightened her grip on Dolly, lifting her eyes but not her head. She answered, "Yes. Would you bring your desert art project to the front of the classroom to share with us, please?" "Okay." Joanne lifted the drawing from the desk and apologized quietly to Dolly, looking around to see if her classmates had noticed. After morning recess, Joanne sat quietly before her math problems, tapping her pencil on her nose. The pencil slipped from her fingers and rolled off her desk. When she bent over to retrieve it, she spied on Pete, who was busily working his equations. Joanne hated math, and third grade math was the worst. She didn't like her annoying seatmate, Pete Fidley, either. All boys were weird, but Pete was weird and mean. Having a girl sit next to her would have been a lot more fun for Joanne, but Mrs. Addington thought Pete would settle down if he sat next to her. Sometimes it wasn't fun being a good girl. At the end of the school day, the cluster of girls in the back of the room giggled and squealed. The boys pushed and punched. Someone said they should have a birthday party every day so they could have cupcakes every day. Joanne pinched a cupcake crumb in her fingers for Dolly to enjoy later. She turned her head to see Dolly was still safely hidden. She thought about how she loved having her little friend nearby. Dolly would never stop being her friend. Dolly was never grumpy or mean. Joanne scrunched her shoulders at the thought of her little sister Sandy hugging Joanne's old doll, the one she'd traded for Dolly. Since she was the oldest, Joanne felt she deserved to have the 4-inch cheerleader doll. It had been easy to convince Sandy to trade her birthday present for the largest doll that had 2 outfits, 2 diapers, and a baby bottle. Dolly was perfect for hiding in Joanne's coat pocket on the way to school every day, perfect for being a friend she'd always wanted. 2 days later, the project in Sunday school was to color a big red Valentine heart with a cross inside it and memorize Matthew 28:20. The heart represented Joanne's life, and the cross represented Jesus in her life. After practicing the scripture verse, "I am with you always to the end of the age," Matthew 28:20, the class had their snack of crackers and Kool-Aid. The Sunday school teacher, Mrs. Boehner, sat on the small chair across the table from the children and asked, "What do you think about Jesus always being with you?" Freddie squirmed. "It's creepy. He comes in the bathroom with me." Laughter filled the room. Miss B smiled. "It doesn't bother Jesus, Freddie. He made you." When the room quieted, Joanne asked, "Does Jesus really see everything?" "Yes, he does." Miss B laid her hand on Joanne's shoulder. "He said he is always with us and he never breaks his promises." She pointed to the Valentine Joanne was coloring. "He's right there in your heart." The next day was dance at school, and Joanne loved dancing. The music made her feet happy, and the movements made her heart happy. She didn't even mind holding a boy's hand unless it was Pete's. He laughed when he squeezed the girl's hands too hard and made them pull back in pain, and he had a wart on his finger. Maybe she'd only pretend to touch his hand. When the line at the drinking fountain shrank and the children rushed to their seats, Pete's math paper floated to the floor. He sat down to pick it up, but it was pinned under his chair. When he ripped in two, he groaned and kicked the desk. The teacher reminded the students to speak quietly with their neighbors. Our neighbors. Several Sundays earlier, Mrs. Boehner had moved the figure of a bearded man in a robe across the board. She called him a neighbor. He didn't look like Pete. But as Joanne glanced at Pete next to her, she realized he was her neighbor, whether she liked him or not. Love your neighbor as yourself. Mark 12:31. That was a memory verse from a long time ago, but it came into her mind from nowhere. She put her hand on her chest, sure that Jesus was speaking to her in her heart. Joanne pictured in her mind a cartoon on TV of a girl falling in love. Her hands were clasped and stars were twirling in her eyes. Flower petals floated above her head and birds chirped. Love was heavenly, but she didn't like Pete Findlay. People didn't like the man in Sunday school story either, but the lesson said Jesus wanted us to be kind to everyone. Joanne clapped her mouth shut and stuck out her chin. Dying on the cross didn't feel good to Jesus, she thought, but he did it to obey his Father in heaven because he loved us. Jesus didn't say I have to marry Pete. He just wants me to treat him like I would want to be treated if I ripped my paper. Her teacher had said the world could spin into only one direction and couldn't change course. But as Joanne's eyes wandered to the globe of the file cabinet, she felt something in her world shifting. She reached into the back of her desk. Would you like some tape to fix your paper? Pete looked at her like she'd grown antennas on top of her head. Sure, okay. She held out her prized roll of tape, knowing he might spoil it or refuse to return it, but that didn't matter. Even if Pete would never be nice to her, she would be nice to him because Jesus told her to. During the circle dance that afternoon, when the boys changed partners and spun them around, Joanne saw Pete coming up next. She heard Jesus in her heart say, "There's your neighbor." This time she wouldn't look for a way to avoid touching him. She clapped her teeth, smiled, grabbed his hand, and curtsied. She found it was actually fun to dance with joy instead of worrying about warts. Pete seemed to enjoy it too, because he skipped more happily than necessary when they parted and he hadn't hurt her hand. On Friday morning, Joanne slipped Dolly from her coat pocket to her hiding place, only to turn around and catch Pete watching her, his eyebrows lifted above his conspiratorial grin. Her breakfast felt heavy in her stomach as she pulled Dolly deep into the darkness of her cubby and walked to the cloakroom to hang up her coat. He knew. Her chest expanded as dread filled her mind. She was going to lose Dolly. Pete would steal the doll or tell on her. She'd be sent home from school with a note to her parents. With her shoulders slumped, she returned to her desk. Jesus told her, "Remember, I am with you always." She exhaled and trusted his words. Jesus promised to always be with her. Maybe he would help her keep Dolly. Turning her head toward Pete as she took out her social studies book, she saw his smirk. "I'm going to tell," he whispered. Joanne knew she was doomed to a life of loneliness. What would she do without her little friend? The bell rang at 2:30, and her teacher dismissed the class. Joanne kept her head down as she lifted her coat above her shoulders and slipped her arms through the sleeves. She knew Dolly had to go home and never come to school again. Waiting until most of the kids were gone, she slid Dolly from her desk and into her homework folder and left the room. When she'd passed the principal's office, she stuck her homework into her library book and dropped Dolly into her coat pocket. Outside, she looked up and down the street for a friend to walk home with, but everyone was gone. Then a glint of blonde hair caught her eye in the gutter. "Dolly, how did you get there?" Joanne picked up the doll and brushed the dirt from her ponytail. Reaching into her pocket to look for a hole, she discovered a rumpled Sunday school drawing of a Valentine and a cross. She was puzzled because she usually gave her drawings to her mother after church. Then she read the verse. She stopped breathing. It was the wrong verse. She was certain the verse had been, I am with you always, but it said, "You are my friends if you do what I command. This is my command, love each other." John 15:14-17. Joanne turned the page over and found her name and her handwriting on the back. She looked at the coloring again. Sure enough, the Valentine was pink instead of red. When had she colored this one? Her cousin's face came to mind. Oh yes, they'd spent Valentine's Day at her uncle's church in Newburgh. That's why this drawing hadn't made it into her mother's hands. Now, when she felt friendless and alone, she found the verse that reminded her that Jesus was her friend. Had he gone into her pocket and pushed Dolly out just to get Joanne's attention? Joanne laughed and shoved Dolly deeper into her pocket. She hugged her library book and homework and skipped the rest of the way home, doing a little dance step at the corner. Wherever Jesus was, whether in her pocket or in her heart, he was her friend, and he'd never leave her. The world was spinning in the right direction after all.